Hello and welcome to the CLI Alpma Innovation and Legal Tech Week. We're halfway through the week and today the theme is people. I'm Emma Heuston, founder and director of The Remote Expert. I'm joined today by Katherine Thomas, CEO of Free Range Lawyers and the CLI Alpma Ambassador of the Day. So I'm very thrilled to be presenting with the Ambassador of the Day. And today, Katherine and I are going to be talking about remote work, but our focus is not on rehashing the experience of COVID. We'll be looking at remote work before 2020 and what the future looks like. And it's easy to see remote work as plan B, but today, Katherine and I will bust some myths, talk about the research and some practical tips. But before we get started, we're going to have our first poll. We're going to see where the audience is at. Do you or some of your team currently work remotely at least some of the time? So that could be 1 day a week, it could be 5 days a week. So pop on over to your screen and vote. And I believe voting will be open for about 30 seconds or so. And as we wait for the votes, I'll just remind you, as Fiona said, that there's questions in a Q&A. You can also comment in the chat, but the questions we get in the Q&A will be what we'll be looking at after we have our chat. Now, I think we've got a lot of converts in our attendance here. So 94% of you work at least some of the days of the week remotely at the moment, and 6% don't. So I would suggest that if we took this survey maybe 12 or 13 months ago, it would have been a bit different. So we'll chat about that. We can't ignore COVID, but I think it's a great chance to look at the future and hybrid work. Over to you, Katherine.
So yeah, just a little bit of an overview of what we're going to chat about today. So Emma and I have structured this as a conversation between the two of us because we both live and breathe remote and hybrid working. But there are some topics that we will cover as we go through. So we're going to give you a bit of context to start off with about us and our interest in this topic. As Emma said, some myth busting. Just looking at the kind of myths that are out there about remote and hybrid working and I guess exploring them afresh. We're going to look at hybrid working, leadership in this context, culture. We're going to look at individuals working remotely and in a hybrid way. We're then going to really get into some of the practicalities around operating in this way and some of the things that your business needs to consider when putting this in place. Then we're going to end by projecting a little bit into the future and sharing our thoughts as to what work styles of the future might look like, summarising with our takeaways. So we're going to kick off and we're going to start with a little bit of context on us. Emma, I know you as the remote expert, great business name, but I'd just love to hear you share a little bit more about the background behind that and your interest in remote working.
Sure. So I have been a remote worker. I'm sort of a three-dimensional remote worker in that I've been a remote employee. I've been partner level in a law firm managing a team. And now I hire a remote team. So for me, it sort of started back in 2017, 2018. I'd been remote working for a few years, but my team was growing. I went to look for a book online to help me kind of manage my growing team. And all I could find were books written by men in America in tech. One of them was actually called My Year Without Pants. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm after. I actually need to write a book myself because I want to know how to be effective, how to set those boundaries. I wrote in 2018 and released The Tracksuit Economy, How to Work Productively and Effectively from Home. And what came from that was that I realized a lot of people were doing it, but it was a dirty secret they had. That their employers were like, well, you can do it, but we don't want everyone to want to do it. And that people were struggling keeping those boundaries, working out how to communicate effectively with a remote team. And the remote expert came from that because a lot of things were happening. So I sort of have two types of clients. Those organizations I help move to remote, existing organizations, but also there's a whole army of people who set up these businesses from home or want to be virtual. And I think COVID has just added an extra level to that, with people realizing that if their in-person presence gets shut down, they've got a backup there online, and actually some clients prefer it. So what about you? Before we get into our lockdown experiences, I guess really free range lawyers, and I love that business name too. It reminds me of kind of chickens and eggs and lawyers running around a paddock. But how has that evolution been? Because you actually started, I think we started a really similar time. I remember chatting to you back then.
Yeah, we started Free Range Lawyers almost exactly 2 years ago. But the seed of it really was way back in 2013, actually, when I was in the UK. I was working for Pinsent Masons, and I set up their contract lawyer service, Vario. And as part, and that was fantastic, and really new at the time and really innovative. But it always struck me that we were always requiring people to be in a city, Manchester, Birmingham, London, to do their work. And so, I started to become interested in remote work from there. And I remember actually having a conversation with a lawyer from New Zealand. And he said, I'm sitting in my office in Auckland at the moment. And he was a banking lawyer. He'd been a banking lawyer in the UK. And he said, I do deals for banks all over the world from my office here in suburban Auckland. And I remember it just got something going in my brain and thinking, that is possible. So I guess that seed kind of grew, and I moved to Australia 5 years ago, and then I needed to avail myself of remote working. So I moved to Perth. I had 3 small children. We only knew 2 people when we moved to Australia. So, I needed to combine establishing my career with, focusing on my family and settling my family into a new country, and working remotely helped me do that. And, from my office here, I work for clients genuinely all over the world. So, I've got a call tomorrow morning with a law firm in Canada. And I think what really excites me about it is the opportunity for diversity that remote work gives. So, it doesn't look, it's really, it's quite early here in WA. I have 3 children who will be getting out to school while we're speaking. And as you said, Emma, this morning, the great thing is that I am able to engage in this summit and have this conversation with you, despite all of the fact that that's happening. So, the opportunities for inclusion and greater diversity of people undertaking quality work really excites me. So long story short, I just wanted to share the wealth. Beginning of 2019, I set up Free Range Lawyers, and it's really about connecting lawyers who work independently and remotely with law firms that are looking to flex their resource up and down. So yeah, that's where my interest comes from. But you did mention lockdown, Emma, and although we are not going to focus on the past, and the impact of COVID is obvious, I think it would be remiss not just to spend a minute or so just acknowledging that. And I know in WA we've been very fortunate in that regard. In New South Wales you've had a little bit more time locked down. I guess I'd just like to hear from you your experience of that last year, and how it affected your experience of remote working.
Yeah, and for us it was nothing like what they had in Victoria. I don't actually know how I would have coped with that, because in March and April last year, having been a remote worker for 6 years prior to that, it was like nothing else I had experienced. So for 6 years prior, I had a really balanced schedule of social catch-ups, time outside my home. My son went to school, and, you know, we did homework in the evening, but we weren't his teachers. And then in COVID, social outings stopped. We could go out for exercise, but not loiter. We were homeschooling, parenting, and working. And look, I really want to urge people to think that if this was your only taste of remote working last year during that period of lockdown when all the schools were shut, and even though you're working, you know, it's sort of expected you would have your kids at home with you, then I urge you to do it when school is on and you can leave your house and have, you know, a lunch out or coffees out, or duck into the office one day a week or something. I urge you to try that again, because for me, that was nothing like normal. And I actually heard people during that time going, oh, I've got all this extra time, I'm not commuting, it's great. Like that. Some people loved it. And I was thinking, wow, it must have been really bad before, because this is actually pretty awful compared to the usual. So I think we do need to acknowledge that COVID was extreme. It was a pandemic. It wasn't a productivity contest. It wasn't the usual type of remote work. And I'd hate to think remote work got tainted with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think it is worth acknowledging that, because for those of us that have done it for a considerable period of time, last year was as novel and as different really for us as it was for anybody. So it's worth acknowledging that. But I think you've really brought us to our next sort of topic, which is myth busting. You know, gosh, remote work was quite a favourite of the media before COVID. It really is now. And, you know, I've lost count of the amount of pieces that I've read that just repeat the usual tropes around this way of working. You know, what, I guess I'd really love to hear, you know, what kind of one or two sort of myths or misnomers do you hear that you think, you know, really need kind of addressing or busting, to use our terminology?
So there could be, I could write another book about this, but I'm going to focus on two. Yeah. And the first one is that, oh, clients won't like it. They'll go somewhere else if you're not in the office. And I think that's not true at all. You know, and one thing COVID has shown us is that our clients' businesses have had to adapt, or they've had to adapt to telehealth, for example, with the doctor. And it's actually really great. It's convenient. And in fact, clients might prefer to deal with you via video call, telephone, email, and limit the amount of face-to-face they have, because it's just easier for everyone juggling everything. And if you think about it, you know, a client calls, you're not in the office, you know, you could be on in court or on a call anyway. So it's really no different. You're working. It doesn't matter where you're working from. It really is the same when a client is trying to contact you. And I've just seen a comment come through that David's family law clients prefer initial appointments via Zoom, as they have all their information there. They feel safer. You know, and in small towns, for example, they're not seen walking into a lawyer's office and that kind of thing. So
it's a really important point, that change, you know, that difference in the way that clients want to consume legal services and our assumptions about their buying behaviour and the reality of their buying behaviour, and perhaps we never stop to ask.
Yeah, and I think 2020 has been, you know, we got the hashtag silver linings thing, but I think that's given us the opportunity to sit back and examine the data from that, and to see that actually clients don't mind it. Some actually prefer it. And it will depend who your clients are, but I think it's worth asking that question and not making the assumption. And the second myth is that working from home is, you know, in inverted commas, because you're slacking off, you're sitting there with Doritos on your chest, watching Netflix, just tapping on the laptop with one finger. in that they're not as productive. And there were actually studies out before COVID about productivity that debunked that myth. And there's a New South Wales government study in November that debunked it further during COVID. And my own personal experience is that you're actually more productive. You've got more time to sit at your desk. There's less water cooler kind of discussions there. And yeah, certainly it's something I think a lot of people are finding with that hybrid model, that if they need client or team meetings, they can do that 1 or 2 days a week and then work from home the rest of the week. Yeah. And that's been a real trend we've seen.
Yeah, that productivity point. I mean, you know, for every person thinking that remote workers are slacking off, there is somebody else who is saying, I'm working too hard and how do I switch off? You know, and of course, you know, what we want is, you know, the happy medium in the middle. But yeah, I hear that those two absolutely. And for me, actually, I've got two as well. Like for me, one is that classic, right, we're going to get everybody back to work when actually what we mean is back to the office. And those that know me know that, you know, I feel quite strongly about the words that we choose. I think words and terminology matters. And that's not done with any kind of agenda. It's just that actually for decades, work has equated to a physical space. And so, you know, we're just used to saying that, but I actually think now we do need to check that terminology. We've been working, we've just been doing it in a different place. And the other one is, and I hear a lot is, but we work better in the office. Now, I guess I'm not going to argue with that because, you know, each organisation and each team is different, and there will be types of work and types of teams that do work better in the office. Because look, the reality is, you know, neither you nor I, we're very clear, we're not kind of dogmatic about this. This isn't saying death to the office and we're all going to work remotely. So it's not, that's kind of less of a myth, but more something that just rolls off the tongue again without us thinking about it. And, you know, I think that what we're often saying when we say I work better in the office is we work better at the ways that we're used to working in the office. It's not, you know, it's not a kind of objective assessment about the efficiency of office work versus other forms of work. It's, I feel comfortable here and I'm better at following the rhythms that I've always followed in the office when I'm in the office. And I guess what I feel is it would be great if we could just challenge that and actually say, well, how do we need to work? What are our sort of modes of working that are fit for 2021? And then how can they be kind of accommodated and maximized through our work styles? So yeah, it's you know, it's not about disagreeing with somebody that says that, but it's just saying, oh, take a moment and maybe acknowledge that that statement is based on your previous experience rather than, you know, any kind of objective assessment around.
Yeah. And I think it's about challenging your assumptions. Of course, it works better if you have systems and processes and workflows set up to support that. Yeah. But if you then have systems and processes and workflows set up to support someone working away from the office, then that could work as well. It's about working to the event, and we'll touch on hybrid work later, which is taking the best of both worlds as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've, in our preparation for this, you know, we've talked a lot, haven't we, about actually the very conceptual nature about this topic and the fact that, you know, we have some deeply ingrained perceptions about the nature of work that we brought to the beginning of 2020, but even prior to that we brought to remote and distributed work. And, you know, a lot of the discussion around this topic is, as you say, kind of challenging those preconceptions. Is it worth moving on, Emma, to
Yeah, I think so.
hybrid working. Yeah, because we've discussed, we've just been talking about remote work, but I think the reality is, and the reality that most of us have experienced, is that the majority of people actually do a combination of in-office and remote work. I don't know whether that's your experience, Emma, from your kind of client base, that hybrid work seems to be, the way that we're adopting this work style.
It is, and I did a poll. I did a presentation back in December, and before that I did a poll of 65 lawyers, and about 80% of them, that their plan was to work hybrid in future, which was really interesting. And about 10% were going to be in the office full time, and about the other 10% were going to be completely remote full time. So it's definitely where we're seeing, and we've got a poll coming up here as well, what your ideal working week looks like. So here it is. In an ideal working week, how many days would you spend in the office? And it goes through from none right through to 5. So if you could let us know, and there's some questions that have come in that I've taken a note of around, sort of replicating some of the advantages of the office at home. So we will cover that off in the Q&A in the end. But just to get a feel of that. So while we're, they're just to pop up.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So there's a really clear winner there of 2 days. 2 and none, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, and again, this is a theme that we'll be exploring this morning. That goes to show the intensely personal nature of work and work styles, and the fact that actually there are almost as many approaches to work style as there are people working. It's a very individual preference.
Yeah, and I think looking at that poll, clearly hybrid work is here to stay. But Katherine, can you tell us a little bit more about how businesses are implementing it?
Yeah, so we really wanted to touch on this point around hybrid, as well as just pure remote work. And as the name suggests, obviously hybrid working is a combination of in office and out of office work. And I actually use the term out of office advisedly, because it's not necessarily office versus home. It's around work that takes place in an office and then work that takes place elsewhere in a distributed way. So, that could include, for example, I think what are starting to be called kind of micro hubs. So I know in the UK, for example, Allen and Overy have got a micro hub south of the river in London, which is very much about providing people with somewhere to go to work, but that isn't going to involve them, in an hour and a half commute, is more convenient and more proximate to their home and their community and their lives. So I think the first point I want to make, I guess, is that, hybrid working is not in office versus home. It's actually in office and then a whole host of other options. And the reality is that most of us have been doing this in one way or another for a long time. So again, the kind of the media would have you believe that this just was suddenly invented in 2020. We don't have a poll for this, but if we did take a poll of attendees here, we'd probably find out that the majority of you have been doing some kind of hybrid working for quite a while. And whether that's, working from home when you have a particular kind of personal need for flexibility, whether it's actually just working off-site at clients' offices, that is hybrid working. Anything that involves not going into the office 5 days a week is hybrid working. But it has been, this year it's filled some column inches, and there have been quite a few commentators that have suggested that it just won't work. It simply can't work because it's a suboptimal experience for everybody. And if you did want to go online and explore kind of this debate a little bit more, actually, the CEO of GitHub is a really good place to start. So if you're aware of tech company GitHub, they're really one of the poster children for a fully distributed workforce. So they don't, their people aren't office based. But what their CEO has been talking about very much this year is the fact that he just believes that, a combination of working in an office and remotely, it just isn't feasible. Because in his view, there is a suboptimal experience for everybody. And I find his comments, although I don't necessarily agree with them, I think they are really thought-provoking, because again, they point back to what we discussed at the start of this chat, which is how much of that is based on experience and empirical evidence, and how much is it based on an assumption founded in just simply our experience of what went before. So for him, all of his employees worked in a distributed way. He was comfortable with that. Hybrid working, represents a change. How do we go about doing that? So yeah, Emma, hybrid working is really interesting because it kind of gets to the heart of challenging those organizational and behavioral norms, I think. And it's even more than remote work, actually, I think challenges us to think about how things could be in the future. And if I may, I just wanted to share with you a couple of ideas. I've been thinking a lot about this over the last year, how can we make this new way of working successful? And a few thoughts on that. I think the first thing is, human behavior is very malleable. So look at this summit, look at what we have achieved. CLI and Outba have achieved, over this week, how professional it has been. And how well participated it has been. And there is no question that it would have been very different if we'd done that this time last year. Even the operation of Zoom, none of us would have been so familiar with it. So, human behavior is really malleable. So there's nothing to say that we can't put in place norms and behaviors that support hybrid working in exactly the same way that we have over decades put in place norms and behaviors that support in-office working. So, things like every meeting that you have, having a video con link as part of the invitation. So, if people are in the office, they can go into a room. But if people just aren't in the office, there's somewhere that they can zip into, and just logging onto video conference as the norm for every meeting that happens. Or and the more challenging, but implementing a cultural change where, it becomes as unacceptable to kind of have the chat to the side in a meeting, the chat between the people that are physically present. It becomes as unacceptable to have that sort of side chat, not including your people joining remotely. It becomes as unacceptable to do that as it is to kind of pass notes under the table. And I just think the existence of this conference is really testament to the fact that all of that stuff is achievable, if only we'd try it.
Yeah, and it's great. Like, I'm in Ballina, far northern New South Wales. You're in Perth.
Yep.
And we would have had to fly into Melbourne or Sydney or wherever it was, and that would have been quite disruptive as well. So it just shows, and there are people now from around the world who can watch this, whereas it would have been limited to people who could fly in and attend. So it's very different. And I think there's a lot of benefits. Over the last year, I've been to a lot of conferences where there's international guests, which just wouldn't have been the case beforehand. And look, I think you're right. Everyone is getting used to it. And I've been the remote worker, going to a lunchtime meeting, watching all the in-office people with a few, there were about 3 of us, about 10 in-office people eating their lunch, and being that floating kind of head on a laptop, which is not, it's not, inclusive. It's better to have that link and then be really mindful of that. And I think this year has taught us that that's something we are more mindful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually I didn't, I'm ashamed to say I didn't realize this before we were preparing, but I now know that I'm in the presence of a television star, because it did, you were on, was it television or radio, but you were on the Today Show talking about this a few years.
Yeah, television.
Probably when it was more radical, you know.
It was when I released my book, so back in 2018. So it was really coming up 3 years ago, with Mark McCrindle, the social researcher. So he's the other guy they get when Bernard Salt's not available.
Oh, right.
I think you sort of see either one of them talking about social research things. So I talked to Georgie Gardner and Mark McCrindle about work-life balance and working from home. And I talked about my experience. And at that point in 2018, Mark McCrindle said the research was that hybrid balance was actually optimal. It allowed people that work-life balance for family time, less commuting, more time for leisure. Because, you know, I think we sort of structured our current office environment. It harks back to the Industrial Revolution, where everyone went into a factory, but offices are kind of professional factories almost. And you had but that time it was 8 hours play, 8 hours rest or sleep, and 8 hours at work. But with the invention of smartphones and technology, I think that 8 hours play has been, you know, the 8 hours work has become like 12 hours work or more for some people. So, you know, working from home is really an adaptation. We've got technology now, it's there. The only barrier is what's between our ears to use it. So, yeah, and I think, and I've seen various people say, oh, we've advanced the cause of working from home, online business, you know, 10 years in the last year. I don't know how they've got that stat, but I do know that we are a lot further ahead in that discussion. So we might move on now. I think it's a good time to move on to leadership. We're going to be looking at leadership, culture, and individuals in the workplace.
Yeah.
So on that note, Katherine, you've done a fair bit of work to understand what more academic research tells us on the best way to lead and manage a team. So what have you learned around, what's sort of the research and best practice around academics and leading a distributed team?
Yeah, it's again, at the start of last year, if I'm being really honest, it was driven by a frustration at seeing, you know, all of these articles that were kind of just based on gut instinct. Like, there is nothing like remote and distributed work for people to feel that, you know, they can share an opinion, but not necessarily any evidence. And so that really kind of drove me to start looking at what studies and experience and research tells us about the best way to work in a hybrid or remote or distributed way. And actually what emerges are a few really interesting but key messages. The first is around trust. So I think the sort of godparent of team behavior, someone called Patrick Lencioni, first looked at this quite negatively, which is 5 dysfunctions of a team. And he looked at the 5 ways that teams kind of self-sabotage, and lack of trust was the most common way that teams self-sabotage. So his work kind of identified the importance of trust to effective team working. And really, then there was a whole host of research that built on that. And we're talking about way back in the 90s, again, before remote and hybrid working was a thing. There was a really interesting study done at Stanford University that actually wanted to explore whether kind of our received wisdom that you earn trust over time you know, whether that is necessarily true or whether there are other ways to develop trust. And the research was based on, you know, this notion that Lencioni had developed, that, you know, trust is just vital to effective teams. I mean, I won't go into the detail of the research now, but essentially the results of that suggested that, you know, whilst trust can be developed over lots of face-to-face and interpersonal interactions over a period of time, it is also possible to develop trust very quickly. And the terminology swift trust came from this. And so the notion that rather than you earning my trust, Emma, over time, over lots of different conversations and interactions, it is also possible, if we need to work together really quickly from day one, it is also possible for me to just give you my trust and behave as though you already have it. And then your subsequent actions will either confirm or deny that. And so what's really interesting about that is that started a lot of thinking and challenging really the received notion that the only way that teams could be effective is if they've been co-located together for an awful lot of time and, you know, develop those deep relationships. And then if you've kind of fast forward a couple of decades, as remote and hybrid working became sort of more common and more embedded, we got a whole load of more research looking at the concept of swift trust in that context. And actually, again, there was a particular study that looked at a whole load of master's students who had to collaborate across the globe. So they were literally on every single continent. And that looked at whether you could prevent physical distance creating psychological difference, you know, so whether they could function effectively as a team. And if so, what they did to be effective. And they found a few things. The first thing they found was absolutely that this concept of swift trust exists, and it is absolutely possible to create trust in a swiftly assembled remote working team. But they also found 4 other things that I just thought were really fascinating for anybody looking at kind of leadership in that remote and hybrid working context. The first was they found that hierarchical top-down leadership just does not work as well when we're talking about distributed working. You need to be much more democratic in your style. So with these master's students, actually, it was the teams that rotated the leadership that were actually much more effective than those that appointed just one leader. Who, you know, sort of handed down in tablets of stone the way that things were going to be. The second finding, and for me, look, I find this the most interesting, is that the teams that were really effective had a focus on tasks and goals rather than process. What they found was the teams that had low levels of trust and didn't operate as effectively, they kind of couldn't move on from procedure and rule setting, you know, so like, we will meet every Wednesday at this time. We will submit our work every Friday at this time. There's nothing wrong with that, right? That we need structure. But what this research was saying was that the teams that were less effective couldn't get beyond that. They were just clinging on to the rungs of this structure and thinking that that made a team. Whereas the high trust distributed and remote working teams might have had some kind of structure, but actually they then moved beyond that to say, but what's really important is, what's our goal? What are we trying to achieve? Who's going to do what? Off you go. So we're much more focused on the task and the goal, and the rules and procedures were secondary to that and only existed to support that. And that really, for me, and maybe it's just me, but that really kind of flicked on a light bulb for me, because there's a lot of discussion around how much structure you put in place when people are working remote in a remote and hybrid way. And there's no doubt that some is needed. But what this study suggests is what's more important is that focus on what you're doing.
It sort of moves from that argument about bums on seats. I want to see you working, and I saw David put a comment, if I can't see you, I can't rely upon you doing the work.
Yeah.
And that's what I call the bums on seats mentality, whereas what you're talking about and the research supports is that output. So let's look at what output you're getting. Let's look at these tasks. And if you get there a slightly different way to someone else, then that's okay, as long as it's you know, not breaching anything you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, totally. That output focus, which we talk about a lot actually in the law, in terms of measuring inputs versus.
And I think in law, you know, a lot of it's sort of that argument in law between fixed fee to time-based billing, which a lot of lawyers, you know, it's pretty hot topic in a lot of the lawyers groups online as well. So we might move.
Sorry, Emma.
Oh, I was going to say it's quite a significant shift in the way we operate, those sort of leadership observations there. And no doubt leadership feeds directly into culture. And there have been lots of articles suggesting that culture is lost when we're working remotely. And I saw a comment earlier in there saying that how do you replicate the water cooler casual conversations? And that's part of culture. It's not the only thing. Culture is a really intangible thing, but it is part of it. And so what are your thoughts on that? Does culture die if we're not in a physical place together regularly?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I know that there are many people out there that feel that if it doesn't die, it certainly becomes quite sick, you know, if we're not all co-located. And there's some really interesting issues to discuss around that. I think I actually, and have found for those that are interested in it, it'd be quite useful to look up. There's a really simple model from Edgar Schein, that talks about 3 layers of culture. So like underlying assumptions, the values that you share, and then your kind of tangible physical artifacts. And it's quite a useful way to think about culture, because then, you know, what we can do is explore remote and hybrid working in that context and say, well, that opportunity for displaying culture through physical means, through physical artifacts, through physical use of space is definitely diminished, you know, when you're working remotely and in a hybrid way, you know, and that concept of, you know, it's how we do work here. You know, the reality is it's the way we do with things around here, and you know, here is assumed to be in the office, but of course with remote and hybrid working, here becomes, you know, something very different. So I think that's the first point. We need to recognize that we've got fewer opportunities to visibly and tangibly share our culture. You know, so no cafe, no hub, no posters, you know, in the kitchen, no person behind the security desk, you know, who you know really well and chat to every morning. You know, no corner office, you know, no dress down Fridays, all of the kind of stuff that we're used to seeing that symbolizes our culture. I guess what I would suggest is your culture is pretty flimsy if it falls down just when those physical attributes kind of aren't available to you. You know, you've still got those underlying assumptions, which are very much demonstrated simply through the way people interact, you know, day in, day out. You've got those underlying assumptions, and then you've got the values, you know, the common language, the way you express what your firm is all about. So I think the assumption that culture dies if you don't have an office is absolutely worth challenging. And, you know, for those that are interested in it, those IT companies, you know, Basecamp, Zapier, GitHub is another one, have actually really done a great job of creating a playbook for working in a remote and distributed way. And they've open sourced it, and they, you know, you can just get it on the internet. And they talk a lot about the kind of things that they put in place to create and and maintain culture as part of their organisation. So it's worth looking at that.
And I think on a practical level, it's about replicating, say, well, we miss those water cooler casual conversations. There's no reason you can't arrange a coffee catch up with someone via Zoom, your team, or have a chat screen going, or have a phone call. I actually, with my team, I prefer phone calls over everything. So it's really, it's really about thinking, well, what do I miss? What can I do to get that? Or it could be meeting for a team lunch every couple of weeks, and then having that daily interaction as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also, for every benefit of having the physical opportunity to demonstrate culture, there's drawbacks. So, we're human beings. So if we have physical space, for example, we will use that for good and ill, really. So, demonstrating power and authority, as well as demonstrating perhaps some of the more, positive attributes of our culture. So it's really breaking that down, as you've suggested, and saying, what is it that's really important to us, and how can we make that happen in the context, in this remote and hybrid working context that we're faced with?
Oh, for sure. And there's pros and cons to both options. And, I don't miss the passive aggressive notes in the office about tuna sandwiches and, no one's washing their coffee cups. So, that's a benefit. But yeah, it is nice making a coffee or a cup of tea in the kitchen and having a chat to someone you might not have had a chat to. So it's very much just about doing what's right for you. And I know as a busy parent, once I became a parent, Friday night drinks kind of just weren't a thing anyway. So I think it depends where you're at in your stage of life and what you're after as well for that interaction.
Couldn't agree more, Emma. And it does move us, I think, neatly on, your point around, it's an individual thing. It's a lovely segue into the next section and looking at us as individuals now. So moving on from the big picture, the culture, from leadership down to, all of us are remote or hybrid workers or have been. And I guess I'd just be really interested to hear from you about whether there's a type of person or a personality that is most suited to remote or hybrid working.
So I think, first of all, I think everyone can remote work if it's available in their role, but it's making it work that's the important thing. So if you're an extrovert, you might actually feed off the energy of someone in an office. So instead of working from home, you might work in one of those micro hubs you were talking about, or a co-working space, and making sure you get that interaction with people. Or you might like more stand-up meetings or something like that. Whereas if you're an introvert, you might not like that. If you like routine, you might take yourself on a walk around the block for half an hour before you go to work to mimic your commute if you feel that clears your head and gets you in the right mindset. So I think the short answer is there might be some people who are more intrinsically suited, but I think anyone can do it. And the comments I've seen in the chat today as we've been chatting are all about saying flexibility is key and everyone is unique. And it's finding the right fit for you, the right role, the right procedures, the right level of social contact that may not be work contact. I am a business owner now, but I sort of make sure I see some of the mums of my son's friends, semi-regularly, because that gives me social contact. And I feel that social contact's enough rather than the business contact. So it's really about working out what's right for you.
Yeah, and it is very individual. I know we undertake psychometric assessments when we're looking at our free range lawyer applicants, really to understand whether there's a fit between the person and working remotely and on a contract basis. And the reality is that we don't have a kind of cookie cutter. There are certainly certain behaviours that recommend somebody to remote working, self-management, a kind of completer, finisher focus, that kind of stuff. But actually, the reality for us is that a whole host of people can do it. Some people will be very predisposed to it. Others won't find those behaviours come naturally. But actually, if you have in place mitigating strategies to deal with it. So if you know I'm a procrastinator, but I know I'm a procrastinator, and these are the things I do to address it, then absolutely you can make it work. Again, this kind of media would have us believe there's a certain type of person that suits remote working, and it will ever be thus. But I think it's about recognizing the behaviors that make for successful remote work, and then finding how you can incorporate them in the way you operate. Moving on from that, but still on the theme of individuals, again, there's been a lot of talk whilst we've been remote working en masse around junior lawyers and supervision and development. What are your views on how appropriate remote and hybrid working is for people who are more towards the start of their career, Emma?
In my view, senior workers are usually able to come in and pick things up, but it's not impossible for a junior to undertake some remote work. They do benefit, I think, from absorbing the comings and goings in an office and just overhearing conversations. But certainly the law societies have remote supervision plan requirements that you need to put into place for a junior. So it is possible to do that. And even junior lawyers are very different. So you might have a graduate who's a mature age person with experience in another industry that takes to it really well and is quite, but you might have someone who has, left school, gone straight to university and does need that office experience. So again, it's a really unique thing. And if you have a mixed team of junior and senior lawyers, you need to look at that. You need to look at your office space and mentoring and really set your procedures. So I think anything is possible. It is just the way that your team is going to implement that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think that was a big concern of a lot of organisations, particularly in legal, right at the start. But as you say, all the law societies, I think all the law societies have a form of protocol for remote supervision. So I've acknowledged that this is happening and is achievable,
And a few years ago they didn't, because we had that issue when I was managing a girl who had moved to Germany during the last 6 months of her supervision period. And then we had to actually put in submissions. But now they actually have remote supervision plans in New South Wales anyway.
Yeah.
So moving to a practical example, your free range lawyers, they're experienced remote workers. And what do they tell you about remote working from an individual perspective from their placements?
They, very briefly, so they've been doing it, most of them have been doing it for years. So they're really experienced at this. So they kind of understand, how to work this way effectively for the long term, when it's not in response to a crisis or for a very short period. And I actually surveyed them at the end of last year, and it's part of the resources that survey is part of the resources Emma and I are making available to attendees on this webinar. And so just very few clear messages that came through. Well, I'm talking about lawyers who work remotely for law firms here, so that's the particular context. What do law firms do that really helps them to work effectively? It's all about clarity, having a defined point of contact, a clear project plan, and a clear understanding of when communication is going to happen. And when I asked them, well, what do law firms do that kind of hinder their productivity working remotely? Going right back to the points that we discussed with leadership at the start, lack of trust was right at the top. So, an inherent lack of trust of somebody that wasn't in the office. Actually, what my lawyers are telling me is that has an impact on what they're able to do for their law firm. So if we can move towards that swift trust, giving trust and assuming trust until actions suggest otherwise, that can really change the productivity of remote workers. So yeah, clarity and trust were the 2-3 key things that came across from those free range lawyers. Keen to move on now just to the practicalities. You know, we've talked a lot about concepts, quite big picture stuff, Emma, but I know your business is very much involved in helping other businesses that operate largely or wholly remotely and in setting themselves up effectively from a legal perspective. So on a practical theme, you know, what are the things, what is the documentation that businesses need to consider when they're putting in place remote or hybrid working for the long term, Emma?
So there's 5 steps. They're outlined in more detail in my, there's a conference participants free ebook I've got on my website. It's not, it's free to download. There's no kind of email address it's hidden behind. And it's called How to Navigate the Legal Issues. But in summary, there's 5-stage processes. Step 1, make sure everything is in writing. So this will be for new employees, an employment agreement, for existing, a variation of that, to make sure that all their remote work arrangements are suitable, that you've got a self-audit or an audit of their workplace, that all those privacy and data security issues, which is step 2, about who will own the equipment, what sort of logons you have, do you have 2-factor identification. Step 3 is looking at workplace health and safety and audits of remote workspaces to make sure there's lockable cabinets for confidentiality, that there is a confidential and secure workspace, and make sure you're fulfilling your duty of care as an employer. Step 4, we look at insurance and liability, checking with your workers' compensation insurer that working from home is covered. It usually is, but it's always good to have it noted on your policy that someone is working from home or some employees are. And look at the public liability policies attached to your employees' home workspaces if they're working from home there. And step 5 is to make sure your policies are up to date. And they're not necessarily do this, do that. They could be positive policies around flexibility as well. And I think these things are overlooked. And certainly with COVID, everyone kind of, you know, it happened in a few days. So a lot of these things didn't happen. But what we're seeing now is that these arrangements started during COVID, are extended. They're going to be more permanent, but they're not documented. And that leads to a lot of confusion. And I think we will see some cases in the Fair Work Commission coming forward about, you know, an employer trying to get someone back to the office, but oh, hang on, I've been doing my job really well at home for a year. So it's going to be really interesting to see. And I think, you know, to have that discussion and make sure you document it, and particularly for people on awards like paralegal staff, it's important to see that you're meeting the award standards as well and look at it that way. So there is more details, because I'm conscious that we've got questions coming up and where time is ticking. So we might switch to the future now. And you'll get the ebook to download, all participants who've registered here. So Katherine, do you think 2020 was a tipping point for the way we work? And I've just kind of alluded to that as well.
Yeah, I don't think we can experience something like we have, you know, without it creating a permanent shift of sorts. I do have some thoughts to share on that, but before I do, I'd like to launch, if I may, our last poll, just to find out from our participants what you think, whether 2020 was a tipping point for remote and hybrid working, and are things really going to change from now on? So just give you 30 seconds or so. And actually, while everybody's filling in that poll, just wanted to go back to your practicalities point, Emma, and really acknowledge the work that you do on that, and the fact that there is remote working is not just a version of in-office work. It's not in-office work with a few tweaks. It's a remote and hybrid working is a wholly different way of operating. And I think what's great about your work is, you know, you're looking at that afresh and addressing that need and making sure we've got that, you know, compliance in place. Oh wow! So yeah, most people share my thoughts on that, and Emma's too. Look,
Yeah.
It's easy to say, isn't it? Oh yeah, you know, things are never going to be the same again. Some things will be the same, but yeah, I do agree most won't. I think, you know, very briefly, you know, what we're seeing is, we've touched upon these points, clients' buying behaviour has changed. So be alive to that. Be alive to the fact that your clients have gone on this journey as much as you have. Don't make assumptions about the way in which they will want to consume their services from you, and that's corporate and personal services. You know, the way that organizations operate has shifted. This move to remote and hybrid working isn't just changing the way that we work, it's actually changed our mindsets and showed us what's possible and how quickly we can change. So I think, you know, organizations are very much looking at their cost base, you know, moving away, becoming more agile, moving away from necessarily a wholly fixed cost base towards, you know, more contract staff, for example, perhaps a smaller office footprint. I think that, you know, we're looking at more diversity. You know, this shift towards remote and hybrid working is going to open up work to a wider range of people, you know, regardless of geography or home caring responsibilities. And, you know, I think in those key ways we will see a shift. But I guess for me, two notes of caution. I guess the first is any picture that emerges will be nuanced. So I think we've got to cross that point. You know, it's not going to be binary. It's not going to be all or nothing. But also, we have to guard against the fact that it won't necessarily all be good. So, you know, whilst we might see a lot more diversity and flexibility in most places, there is a real danger around fewer boundaries between work and our personal lives and how we're going to manage that. Hybrid working does bring with it the threat of a kind of caste system, you know, favouring the people that are in the office and physically present versus those that aren't. And so it's not to say these things are going to happen, but it is to be realistic and alive to those, you know, to those issues. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Emma, on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And looking about the future of work styles in the legal sector, I think it's great. If you look at Uber and Uber Eats, you know, more contracting, I think might be the case, or temp work as well.
Yeah.
But styles, I think we'll definitely see more hybrid, and I think law firms will start to follow what companies like Westpac and IAG have done before COVID, which was reduce their Sydney office sizes anyway by 20%. They pay less rent, they hot desk, although hot desking's got problems of its own during COVID. You know, they can't fit all these people back in the office or back in lifts. Yeah. So, and I think that, you know, the COVID regulations are going to be around for a while. And I think by the time they come in, companies will be thinking, well, we can halve our commercial lease footprint and halve what we're paying and have, you know, that flexibility there. So I think those work styles will change. I think we'll all have laptops. If we have some in-office commitments, we'll all have laptops to dock. Hot desking, I think, will become a reality, because I think that everyone won't have a permanent desk in an office. Yeah. That's my prediction.
If you're in 2 days a week, is there a need? Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's probably time to conclude and move to some of the fabulous questions that we've got. Very briefly, takeaways. You know, hopefully we've given you food for thought. Some of the things I know Emma and I would like you to take away from this session, you know, the individual nature of work styles and the need for flexibility with regard to each individual. Challenging assumptions and recognizing that our view of what work is based on our experience over decades, and what has been isn't necessarily going to be what is in the future. You know, the fact that there's no need to be dogmatic about this. You know, offices are good, remote and distributed working is good. Let's find a way to combine the best of both of them. And Emma's point really around practicalities, not just seeing remote and hybrid working as a version of office working with tweaks, but really taking a proper look at your policies, procedures, and your documentation to make sure that you're fit for purpose for this new way of working. So those are the takeaways. I think we've got quite a few questions to have a look at, Emma.
We do, and I've been sort of making a note of them as we go from the chat and the Q&A. The first one is from Vinu. Do you think open shared workspaces can be a filler and supportive of a remote work environment? So I'm guessing hot desking or sort of co-working there. Do we think that's a good kind of option? So maybe someone works from home a couple of days a week, then co-working a couple of days a week to get that sort of interaction with people rather than talking to your cat all day.
Yeah. Oh, look, I certainly incorporate that way of working into my work style. I don't want to be, much as I love working from home, I don't want to be at home 7 days a week. So I think, yeah, those kind of shared workspaces that, as I said, like that kind of micro hub as well that, some law firms are putting in place, is just, it's a really useful way to give people a change of environment, a different way to focus. But as you say, the option for the quick chat in the kitchen and some kind of face-to-face human interaction. I don't know, do you incorporate that into the way you work, Emma? How do you operate?
I do know. Actually, I employed my husband in the business in August, so I feel like I've got that at home now. But I have a remote lawyer as well, and each Friday I have sort of a get together with some people, not workmates, but socially. And that's probably similar to a co-working space in that, you get to talk to people and deal with that. I see a comment here from Melissa saying we're at a stage now where there is the opportunity to completely redesign workplaces to work best for clients and teams and employees and not just go with what happened during COVID. And I think that's exactly right. I think COVID has shown us what's possible, but now we've got to take a step back and really purposefully look at that. We've got a question here from Monica as well. So how to find remote work. And I would say we'll register with Katherine as a start. But I think too, it's worth asking if you see a position you like, if that is able to be done remotely. I think we need to have those conversations. What do you think, Katherine?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, those conversations will be landing on far more fertile ground now. So perhaps as you say, if you see something that interests you, don't necessarily dismiss it. There will be some organizations that are very clear that their people have to be in the office 100% of the time. And, and that's their prerogative, and it's but it's best to tease that out right at the start. But offering at least asking the question and potentially offering your own solutions as to how you might be able to do that role in a way that works for you and your employee. Coming to the situation with some suggestions or potential solutions, I think is a smart idea. Obviously, as you say, Emma, free range lawyers is an option, but also, if you're looking for permanent work, there are plenty, go on the internet, there are plenty of and a growing number of organizations that are specifically focused on remote roles. So perhaps also start there.
And we've got two final questions here. The first one is, how do you decide as an organisation on a hybrid or flexible work strategy when everyone has really different needs? How do you manage developing a policy that is best for the majority, but it won't necessarily suit the whole? And I think that's really tough, would be my answer to that. But to look at those needs, organizational change managers look at ways that you can co-create with your employees. And I think that's a really good start. Like, ask them what they need or would make them happy. And flexibility might be really different for a 25-year-old as it is to a 45-year-old, for example. They want flexible work, but it could mean that they just want an afternoon a week at home working remotely or something like that. So it's important not to make those assumptions and work out what everyone wants. And as an organization, I mean, you can't say, yeah, sure, take the day off. So you are going to have to make some tough decisions. It's not going to please everyone. It's about what works best for you as an organization, what your people managers can implement. What do you think, Katherine?
Yeah, totally. You know, there will be as many approaches to hybrid working as there are organizations doing it. But I think that question, you know, raises that perennial tension between flexibility, but the need, you know, but you are part of an organization, and by implication, therefore, there is some structure and there is a need for some structure. And where do you draw the line? And where you draw the line is obviously a sort of organization by organization issue. And so, yeah, your point around really looking at the preferences of your people combined with your organization's needs, you know, is absolutely key. And you know, there are some other, you know, I think looking at it as partly as a business model change, again, not just a sort of gloss that we're putting over the top, but actually a much more fundamental shift in the way your business operates, I think will give you the time and the space to look at it appropriately. Because, you know, the reality is, you know, hybrid working, it needs, you know, really we need an output focus in terms of what people are going. So if you've got a clear idea of what you want people to be doing and delivering, that provides a really, you know, that's a really useful starting point, because then you've got that task or goal focus that I talked about earlier. I think secondly, you know, you need some element of structure, and the reality is that any hybrid working approach is going to be a sort of a happy medium between the organization's needs and the individual's needs. So as you say, Emmy, you know, you're not going to be able to say, sure, you can do whatever you want. So it's about understanding and identifying and communicating what that baseline is. So what the minimum structure is, I think, that your organization needs. And predictability, you know, so just putting in place predictable kind of communication so people know when they're checking in and when they don't need to check in, you know, really helps that. So yeah, just looking at it as a broader shift and change, I think, is a really useful way of approaching it.
And I'll go back to Melissa's comment for that. My other comment is to look what your clients want, look what your clients need, and then design around that to be really client-centered. Yeah. And our final question, we've had so many, but this is the final question we have time for, from Tessa. And I'd love to hear your tips on maintaining connectivity between staff in a hybrid model. Staff engagement and inclusivity is a challenge at the moment. So Tessa, I have spent years trying to do that as well. And it's really important. I would encourage you to call up and have a chat with some of your team members, work out what's working for them, what isn't, and work out, you know, the level of involvement they like. So for some, a stand-up meeting every day is too much. For others, they really appreciate it and like seeing the team. I'd use video conference. I'd even have remote sort of coffees and lunch and some chat, and really celebrate each other's wins. When I was managing a larger remote team, that was amazing. It's like, woohoo, you know, you really, your team's win became your win. And that's really important, to sort of have that acknowledgement of each other. And I'll leave the final words to Katherine, because we're about 1 minute to go.
Yeah, just being intentional, I think, about that communication is absolutely key. So that brings our God, we could go on for twice as long, couldn't we, Emma? But that brings our conversation to a close. We hope you've enjoyed it. Just to let you know, this session will be available as part of the on-demand programme for this event. It'll also be available as a video, and probably also as a podcast on the CLI and ALTMA websites. And if you want to receive updates about these topics, the work of CLI and the work of ALTMA, please follow both of them on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for all these lovely comments we're getting, thanking us in the chat. See you later.
Bye for now.